Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/ADSR This series of videos will cover all of the features in Kontakt. We'll continue with the editors. The mapping editor. Samples are the building blocks of Kontakt instruments and are referenced by zones. Zones respond to specific notes and velocity values. Additionally, zones control volume, pan, and tune. To manage all of this, we use a mapping editor. To open the mapping editor, click the button labeled Mapping Editor. The mapping editor consists of three parts: a control strip with 2 rows of buttons and menus, a status line displaying parameters of the currently selected zone, and the zone grid, a 2-dimensional panel with a keyboard at its bottom. The zone grid has scroll bars that allows you to move around, and if your mouse supports it, you can also move around using your mouse. You can also zoom in by clicking the plus and minus buttons. You can also quick zoom to a specific region by holding the Alt key while clicking and dragging to open the rubber band selection. To zoom out again, click on the grid while holding the Alt key. And when you play a note on your MIDI keyboard, a small red marker appears above the corresponding key of the on-screen keyboard. Higher velocities are indicated with a higher position on the grid. Mapping samples manually. You can manually create zones by dragging one or more samples from the browser or your desktop into the zone grid. While dragging, a highlighted region will tell you where zones will be placed on the keyboard. When you release your mouse, the zones will be created. To cancel, just move your mouse outside the mapping editor and release the button. If you drag a single sample into the zone grid, a zone that spans the entire velocity range and placed over one or several adjacent keys will be created. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the grid, the zone will be assigned to a single key. Moving the mouse upwards will gradually enlarge the keyboard range of the zone until it spans the entire keyboard when you are at the top. If you drag multiple samples into the zone grid, a corresponding number of adjacent non-overlapping zones will be created, starting with the key at your horizontal mouse position. And just like when you drag single samples, the vertical mouse position will adjust the size of each zone's key range. When you move your mouse all the way to the top of the grid, all samples will be layered in overlapping zones that span the whole key range. And if you drag multiple samples onto a key of the keyboard below the grid, a corresponding number of zones that evenly divide the velocity range on that key will be created. When you drag multiple samples from the browser, the sort order in which they appeared in the browser will also determine the order in which the corresponding zones will be placed. You can also drag one or more slice loops into the mapping editor. In this case, newly created zones won't belong to the currently selected group. A new group will be created for each loop with the source module set to beat machine mode. Mapping samples automatically. If your samples are not named in a meaningful way but contain information about how to possibly map them, you can use the auto mapping feature. This function is very specific and detailed, so I think you'll be better served with a dedicated video. Look for that in a few weeks. Managing zones. Each zone has the following parameters. Keyboard range. This is the range of adjacent notes on your keyboard that the zone will respond to. Velocity range. This is the upper and lower limit of velocity values the zone will respond to. Root key. This is the source the sample was recorded at. If the zone is being played at this key, no transposition happens. If the root key is set incorrectly, Kontakt will transpose zones based on the distance between the root key and the actual received note. Also, the tracking parameter of the group source module needs to be enabled for transposition to occur. Volume. This lets you specify a volume offset for each zone. The default volume setting for all zones is 0 dB. Pan. This allows you to place each individual zone independently within a stereo panorama. Tune. This lets you change the tuning of a zone within a range of plus or minus 36 semitones. Volume, pan, and tune are intended for non-destructive correction of samples which deviate in volume, pan, or tuning. They work in conjunction with the same parameters in the source and amplifier modules. To modulate these parameters on a per-zone basis, you would use zone envelopes. We'll talk more about zone envelopes in a later tutorial. Editing parameters in the status bar. To view and change parameters of a zone, just select it in the grid. All parameters of the zone will be displayed in the status bar above the zone grid. You can change the parameter by clicking on its value and dragging your mouse upwards or downwards. This is the only way to change volume, pan, and tune, but there are other ways to change keyboard range, velocity range, or root key. Editing parameters graphically. You can change the keyboard range, velocity range, and root key of a zone graphically within the mapping editor. Click into the zone and move the mouse horizontally to move the whole zone across the keyboard. You can also use the left and right cursor keys while holding Control or Command. Click on the left or right border of a zone and drag it horizontally to change the zone size as well as the keyboard range. You can also use the left and right cursor keys while holding Shift and Control or Shift and Command. Click on the upper or lower border of a zone and drag it vertically to change the zone's velocity range. You can also use the up and down cursor keys while holding Control to move the zones by 2 velocity steps. Holding Shift and Control or Shift and Command will change your upper velocity limits. Click on the yellow key on the keyboard below the zone grid and drag horizontally to change the zone's root key. Control or Command click and drag while your mouse is on the left or right border of a zone to create a zone crossfade. Alt-click and drag to open a rubber band zoom frame. When you release the mouse button, the contents inside the selection frame will zoom in to fill the whole pane. To zoom out, Alt-click anywhere on the grid. Also, you can select multiple zones by clicking on them while holding Shift or clicking on an empty space of the grid and dragging the mouse to open a rubber band selection. If you hold Shift, You can open the selection frame anywhere, even on top of zones. If you have overlapping zones, you can cycle through them by control-clicking inside them repeatedly. And to add adjacent zones to your selection, hold Shift. Keep in mind, the status bar will only show values that are identical across selected zones when multiple zones are selected. Editing parameters via MIDI. You can also change the keyboard and velocity ranges of a zone using your MIDI keyboard. Select a zone and enable one or both of the set range via MIDI buttons. This button is for keyboard range, and this button is for velocity range. Next, play two keys on your keyboard. It can be at the same time or one after the other. Kontakt will use the note numbers and velocity of both notes as endpoints for the zone's new keyboard and/or velocity range. Control strip. The control strip is located at the top of the mapping editor and consists of two rows of controls. The edit menu. This opens a drop-down menu with utility functions that operate on all the currently selected zones. List view. This switches a zone grid into a view that displays all groups and zones in a hierarchical list structure. Select zone via MIDI. When enabled, any incoming MIDI note will automatically select any zones that match its note number and velocity. Auto-spread zone key ranges. This function automatically fills holes by extending the key range of each zone on both sides until it touches its neighbors. This function ignores root key. If you want to take into account root key, use auto-spread key ranges via root key instead. Auto-spread velocity ranges. This function works exactly like auto-spread zone key ranges, but works on velocity range instead. Auto map selected. This function will change the parameters and placement of each selected zone based on the information derived from the sample's file name. Auto spread key ranges via root key. This function works just like the auto spread zone key ranges command, except it makes the smallest possible maximum transposition that can occur in each zone by accounting for the root keys and trying to keep them in the center of their respective zone. Resolve overlapping key ranges. This function removes key range overlaps between the selected zones by shrinking the key range of each zone. It takes into account root keys and the smallest possible amount of transposition. This function can also be accessed via the keyboard shortcut Ctrl+R or Command+R. Resolve overlapping velocity ranges. This function works just like resolve overlapping key ranges, but works on the velocity ranges instead. This function can also be accessed via the keyboard shortcut Shift+Ctrl+R or Shift+Command+R. Set key range via MIDI. If this button is enabled and a zone is selected, Kontakt will use the next two incoming MIDI notes as the endpoints for a new key range for the selected zone. Set velocity range via MIDI. If this button is enabled and a zone is selected, Kontakt will use the velocities of the next two incoming MIDI notes as endpoints for a new velocity range for the selected zone. Lock zones. If this button is enabled, the key and velocity ranges of all zones will be protected from being changed graphically inside the zone grid. Solo zone. This button will mute all zones except the currently selected ones. Once enabled, the solo function will follow your selection. Selected groups only. When this button is enabled, the mapping editor will only show zones that belong to the currently selected group. Auto select group. When this button is enabled, the group selection will follow your zone selection. Sample field. This text field displays the file name of the sample that's assigned to the currently selected zone. If you hover over the field with your mouse, the full path is displayed. Also, if you use the next and previous arrow buttons, you can assign a new sample. The buttons will switch to the previous or next sample in the folder of the current one. The Edit menu. The Edit menu is a drop-down menu that contains utility functions that operate on the currently selected zones. It also contains clipboard commands, functions that allow you to reassign zones to different groups, authentic expression technology commands, and options that affect the display and editing behavior of the mapping editor. Cut zones. This moves the selected zones to the clipboard for later use. Zones are removed in the process. Copy zones. This copies the selected zones to the clipboard. Duplicate zones. This creates identical copies of the selected zones. Copies will be placed on top of the originals and will be selected so that you can move them immediately. The keyboard shortcut is Ctrl-D or Command-D. Paste zones. This inserts the contents of the zone clipboard into the mapping editor. The zones will appear in the same place they were cut or copied from. Delete zones. This removes the selected zones from the mapping editor. Exchange sample. This opens a file chooser dialog that lets you assign a new sample to the selected zone. This function will keep all the other zone parameters intact. Select all zones. This selects all zones in your instrument, even those in other groups, and even if select groups only is enabled. Deselect all zones. This clears all active zone selections. Move zones to new empty group. This creates a new group with default settings and reassigns all currently selected zones to it. Move zones to new clone group. This creates a new group with the same settings as the group the first selected zone is assigned to. Move to existing group. This opens a submenu that contains a list of all groups in the current instrument. Select one to move all currently selected zones to this group. Move each zone to its own group empty. This works the same as move zones to new empty group, except it creates a separate empty group for each zone. Move each zone to its own group clone. This works the same as move zones to new clone group, except it creates a separate clone group for each zone. Batch tools. This opens a submenu with utility functions that operate on multiple zones. We'll take a look at these functions shortly. Create AT morph layer. This opens a dialog that lets you analyze the samples of the selected zones and save them to a new morph layer. These layers are the basic building blocks of AET. We'll cover AET in a future tutorial. Auto move root key. This is a toggle, and when enabled, moving a zone will move its root key along with it. Show sample names. This is a toggle as well, and when enabled, the file names of the assigned samples will be displayed within the rectangles of the zone. Names may be hidden if a zone rectangle is too small. In that case, you may have to zoom in to be able to see the name. Map mode. These settings affect how the mapping editor will behave when you drag multiple samples from the browser into the zone grid. The default is chromatic, and with chromatic, new zones will be assigned adjacently across both black and white keys, and you use your vertical mouse position to adjust the size of each zone. White keys only. With this option, new zones will be assigned to single adjacent white keys. Black keys only. New zones will be assigned to single adjacent black keys. Snap to white keys. This works just like chromatic, except the low key of each zone will be placed on a white key. Snap to black keys. The low key of each zone will be placed on a black key. Batch tools. Batch tools contain functions to place root keys and create crossfades. Auto apply crossfades key. This creates crossfades between all selected zones whose key ranges overlap. Active crossfades are indicated with the shaded area. You can also create crossfades manually by Control or Command clicking and dragging the left or right border of a zone. Auto apply crossfades velocity. This creates crossfades between all selected zones whose velocity ranges overlap. Remove crossfades key. This removes all key range crossfades from the selected zones, reverting them back to normal overlapped zones. Remove crossfades velocity. This removes all velocity range crossfades from the selected zones, reverting them back to normal overlap zones. Move root keys to lower border. This moves the root key of each selected zone to the lowest note in the key range. Move root keys to center. This moves the root key of each selected zone to the center of the zone's key range. Move root keys to upper border. This moves the root key of each selected zone to the highest note in the key range. The mapping editor is an important part of Kontakt as it tells instruments what samples to play and how to play them. It also contains a lot of functions for managing your zones and performing batch operations on them. We left out zone envelopes, AET, and automap for now, but don't worry, we'll come back to those later. And don't forget to check out our website at www.kontakttutorials.com for more tutorials on Kontakt. ADSR Kontakt tutorials, supercharge your Kontakt skills. This is DJ Nice signing off until next time. Now go make some music.